The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble corridors of Kensington Palace as Charlotte Elizabeth Windsor made her way toward the East Wing. Her footsteps echoed softly against the polished floors, a sound that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat over the past 16 years of her life. Today felt different somehow, though. She couldn't quite place why. The air seemed heavier, charged with an electricity that made her skin prickle with anticipation. Charlotte had always been different from her brothers, where George was being groomed for kingship with mathematical precision, and Louis bounced through life with the carefree spirit of a youngest child. She occupied a unique space in the royal hierarchy, too important to ignore, yet not quite essential enough to be the primary focus. This middle ground had shaped her into someone who observed more than she spoke, who listened more than she commanded. The music room had become her sanctuary over the years. Located in a quieter section of the palace, it offered her something precious and rare in royal life: solitude. The room itself was a masterpiece of Georgian architecture, with floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with natural light during the day. An ornate Steinway grand piano dominated the center, its ebony surface reflecting the crystal chandelier that hung overhead like a cascade of frozen stars. But it wasn't just the beauty of the room that drew Charlotte here daily. It was the freedom it represented. Within these walls, she wasn't Princess Charlotte or the spare heir or any of the dozen other titles that defined her public existence. Here, she was simply a young woman who could lose herself in melody and rhythm, who could express emotions that royal protocol demanded she keep carefully contained. Her piano teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, had been coming to the palace for 3 years now. A distinguished woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair always pulled back in an elegant chignon, Mrs. Hartwell had trained at the Royal Academy of Music before establishing herself as one of London's most sought-after private instructors. She had worked with several notable families, but the Windsor account was undoubtedly her most prestigious. What Charlotte appreciated most about Mrs. Hartwell was her complete lack of deference. While palace staff bowed and curtsied and addressed her as Your Royal Highness with every breath, Eleanor simply called her Charlotte and expected nothing less than excellence. In their lessons, Charlotte wasn't royalty. She was a student, and sometimes a frustrating one at that. Your technique is flawless, Mrs. Wedstone, Hartwell had told her just the week before, but you're playing like you're afraid someone might hear you feel something. Music without emotion is just noise, Charlotte. Beautiful noise, perhaps, but noise nonetheless. The criticism had stung because it rang true. Charlotte had spent so many years learning to school her expressions, to present the perfect royal facade, that she'd almost forgotten how to be genuinely spontaneous. Even in private, the habits of a lifetime were difficult to break. This particular Tuesday morning, Charlotte had decided to work on Chopin's Ballade No. 1. The piece was challenging, requiring not just technical skill but emotional depth, exactly what Mrs. Hartwell had been encouraging her to develop. She'd been practicing segments of it for weeks, but today she felt ready to attempt playing it through completely. The palace was unusually quiet. Her parents were in Scotland for a series of engagements, George was at university, and Louis was at school. The skeleton staff that remained moved through their duties with the efficiency of people who knew they were largely unobserved. It was the kind of solitude Charlotte craved but rarely experienced. She settled at the piano bench, adjusting her posture in the way Mrs. Hartwell had drilled into her countless times. Her fingers found their positions on the keys, and she began the opening measures. The melody flowed from her fingertips, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. This was what she lived for, these moments when the outside world faded away and nothing existed except the music and her connection to it. As she progressed through the piece, something shifted. Perhaps it was the empty palace around her or the way the morning light played across the piano keys, but Charlotte found herself playing with an abandon she'd never allowed herself before. The music swelled and dipped, carrying emotion she'd kept buried for years. Frustration at the constraints of her position, longing for a normal life, the weight of expectation she'd never asked for, it all poured out through her fingers onto the keys. She was so lost in the music that she didn't notice the figure watching from the doorway. James Rothwell had been assigned to the palace guard for 2 years, but he'd never seen anything quite like this. He'd been making his routine patrol when he heard the piano music drifting from the East Wing. Palace protocol dictated that he should note the activity and continue on, but something about the intensity of the playing made him pause. He recognized Princess Charlotte, of course. All the guards did. But he'd never seen her like this, completely unguarded, vulnerable in a way that made him feel like an intruder just by observing. The music she was playing was complex and emotional, and she threw herself into it with a passion that was mesmerizing. James knew he should leave. This was clearly a private moment, and his presence, even unnoticed, was inappropriate. But something rooted him to the spot. Perhaps it was the realization that this was the first time he'd ever seen any member of the royal family appear truly human, truly free. Charlotte reached the climax of the piece, her entire body moving with the music, her face transformed by the emotions she was channeling. For a moment, James forgot entirely that he was looking at royalty. He was simply watching a young woman pour her heart out through music, and it was beautiful. Then, as the final notes faded into silence, Charlotte became aware of being watched. She turned sharply toward the doorway, her cheeks flushing crimson when she saw the guard standing there. "How long have you been there?" she asked, her voice sharp with embarrassment. James straightened, snapping to attention. "I apologize, Your Royal Highness. I heard the music during my patrol and wanted to ensure everything was secure." It was a weak excuse, and they both knew it. Charlotte's embarrassment quickly morphed into anger, not just at him, but at herself for letting her guard down, for forgetting even for a moment that privacy was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Next time, knock," she said coldly, turning back to the piano. James nodded and retreated, but the image of her playing stayed with him for the rest of his shift. There had been something almost desperate about her performance, as if the music was the only way she could express parts of herself that had no other outlet. Over the following days, Charlotte found herself thinking about the encounter more than she cared to admit. She'd been mortified by the guard's presence, but there had been something in his expression that surprised her. Not the usual mix of deference and curiosity she was accustomed to seeing, but something that looked almost like understanding. She made inquiries, discreetly of course, and learned that the guard's name was James Rothwell. He was 24, had served in the military before joining the palace security team, and was considered one of their most reliable personnel. The information was routine, the kind of basic background she could access about any staff member, but it somehow made the encounter feel more real. James, meanwhile, found himself paying closer attention to the East Wing during his patrols. He told himself it was simply heightened security awareness, but deep down he knew better. He was curious about the princess he'd glimpsed that morning. Not the public figure he'd sworn to protect, but the young woman who played piano with such raw emotion. Their paths crossed again 3 days later in one of the palace's many corridors. Charlotte was returning from a meeting with her private secretary when she encountered James during his patrol. This time, both were prepared for the interaction. "Your Royal Highness," James said, offering the appropriate bow. Charlotte paused, studying his face. "The other morning," she began, then stopped. What was she doing? She couldn't possibly discuss that encounter with a member of staff. "Yes, ma'am?" James prompted gently. "Nothing," Charlotte said quickly. "Carry on." But as she walked away, she found herself glancing back. There had been something in his eyes, something that suggested he understood the awkwardness of the situation, perhaps even regretted it as much as she did. The incident marked a subtle shift in Charlotte's awareness. She began to notice things about the palace staff that she'd previously overlooked, the way they moved through the building like ghosts, present but invisible, necessary but ignored. She'd grown up surrounded by people whose entire purpose was to serve her family, but she'd never really considered what that meant for them as individuals. James represented something new in her carefully ordered world, a person who had seen her without her masks, who had witnessed a moment of genuine emotion. It was unsettling and intriguing in equal measure. As the days passed, Charlotte returned to her music with renewed intensity. If anything, the encounter had made her more determined to find authentic expression through her playing. She began exploring more challenging pieces, pushing herself technically and emotionally in ways Mrs. Hartwell had been encouraging for months. During one particularly intense practice session, she was working through a complex Rachmaninophone prelude when she became aware of movement in the corridor outside. The music room's heavy doors were designed to contain sound, but she'd left them slightly ajar for air circulation. Through the gap, she caught a glimpse of James passing by on his patrol. This time, he didn't stop to listen. He maintained his professional pace, his expression neutral, but Charlotte noticed the slight hesitation in his step as he passed the room. She wondered if he could hear the music, if he was curious about what she was playing, if he remembered their previous encounter as vividly as she did. The thought distracted her enough that she fumbled the passage she'd been working on. Her fingers tangled on the keys, producing a discordant crash that echoed through the room. She stopped playing abruptly, frustrated with herself for letting her concentration waver. It was then that she heard footsteps returning in the corridor. A moment later, there was a soft knock on the doorframe. "Your Royal Highness? Is everything all right?" James's voice carried a note of genuine concern. Charlotte hesitated. She could dismiss him with a word, maintain the proper distance between royal and staff. Instead, she found herself saying, "Come in." James entered cautiously, his posture respectful but relaxed. "I heard the music stop suddenly. I wanted to ensure there wasn't a problem." "Just a difficult passage," Charlotte said, surprised by her own honesty. "Sometimes the fingers don't cooperate with the mind. May I ask what you were playing?" It sounded, he paused, searching for the right word, intense. Charlotte studied his face, looking for signs of false interest or mere politeness. Instead, she found what appeared to be genuine curiosity. "Rachmaninoff, Prelude in G minor. It's not an easy piece, I imagine not. You play beautifully, though. What I heard before it stopped, I mean." The compliment was simple and unadorned, lacking the flowery language usually employed by people speaking to royalty. Charlotte found it refreshing. "Thank you," she said. "Do you know much about classical music?" "Not much, I'm afraid. My musical education ended with learning chopsticks on my grandmother's old upright when I was 8. James's self-deprecating smile was warm and genuine. "But I know what moves me when I hear it." Charlotte felt an unexpected flutter of pleasure at his words. When was the last time someone had commented on her music without it being filtered through the lens of royal protocol? "Would you like to hear the piece properly?" she asked, surprising them both with the offer. James glanced toward the corridor, clearly thinking of his duties. "I wouldn't want to interrupt your practice, ma'am." "You wouldn't be interrupting. Sometimes it's nice to have an audience." Charlotte positioned her hands over the keys. "Besides, this particular piece is meant to convey deep emotion. Having someone to play for might help me find the right interpretation." What followed was one of the most remarkable musical experiences of Charlotte's life. With James standing quietly near the piano, she played through the Rachmaninoff Prelude with a depth of feeling she'd never achieved before. Knowing that someone was truly listening, truly present in the moment with her, unlocked something in her performance. The music filled the room with rich, complex harmonies that seemed to resonate not just in the air but in the silence between the notes. Charlotte lost herself in the piece, her earlier self-consciousness forgotten in the face of the emotional landscape Rachmaninoff had created. When the final notes faded away, the silence that followed felt almost sacred. Charlotte looked up to find James watching her with an expression of something approaching awe. "That was extraordinary," he said quietly. "I had no idea music could be so powerful." Charlotte felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of playing. Music is one of the few truly universal languages. It can express things that words never could. "I can see why you spend so much time here," James said, glancing around the elegant room. "It must be peaceful." "It's the only place I can be completely myself," Charlotte admitted, then immediately regretted the revelation. She'd shared too much, crossed a line that should have remained firmly in place. But James didn't seem to find her honesty inappropriate. Instead, he nodded with understanding. "Everyone needs a sanctuary." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the corridor, another guard making his rounds. James immediately straightened, his professional demeanor sliding back into place like armor. "I should return to my duties," he said. "Thank you for the music, Your Royal Highness." As he moved toward the door, Charlotte felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. "James," she called after him, using his name for the first time. He turned back, eyebrows raised in surprise. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked. "If you're on duty, I mean. I'm working on a new piece." A slow smile spread across James's face. "I'd like that very much, ma'am." After he left, Charlotte sat at the piano for a long time, not playing, just thinking. She'd just done something unprecedented, invited a member of staff to a private, informal interaction. It went against every rule of protocol she'd been taught since childhood, but for the first time in years, she didn't care about the rules. James had listened to her music not because it was his duty, but because he genuinely wanted to. He'd seen her as Charlotte the musician, not Charlotte the princess. In a life where authentic human connections were rare and precious, that was worth any breach of protocol. As she finally gathered her sheet music and prepared to leave the music room, Charlotte realized that tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. She had a new piece to master, and for the first time, she had someone to play it for who would hear not just the notes, but the person behind them. The palace around her felt different as she made her way back to her apartments. The corridors seemed less imposing, the silence less oppressive. Perhaps it was her imagination, but even the portraits of long-dead ancestors seemed to regard her with something approaching approval. Change, Charlotte reflected, sometimes announced itself with fanfare and ceremony, but sometimes it arrived as quietly as footsteps in a corridor, as gently as applause for a piece well played, as simply as someone seeing you for who you really are beneath all the titles and expectations. Tomorrow would bring new music, and with it, the possibility of something she'd never dared hope for, a genuine human connection in the most unlikely of places. As she settled into her evening routine, Charlotte found herself humming the Rachmaninoff prelude, and for once the melody didn't sound lonely. It sounded like the beginning of something beautiful. The next morning arrived with an unusual energy that seemed to permeate every corner of Kensington Palace. Charlotte woke earlier than necessary, her internal clock seemingly adjusted to accommodate the anticipation she felt about the day ahead. She'd spent much of the previous evening selecting the perfect piece to share with James, something that would showcase her technical abilities while also conveying the emotional depth that Mrs. Hartwell was always encouraging her to explore. She'd finally settled on Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece that had always held special meaning for her. There was something about its dreamy, impressionistic quality that felt like a musical representation of longing, for freedom, for understanding, for connection. It seemed perfect for this unprecedented situation she found herself navigating. Charlotte's morning routine proceeded as usual on the surface, but internally she was acutely aware of every passing minute. Her lady's maid Sarah noticed her charge's distracted state but attributed it to pre-performance nerves. Princess Charlotte had several public engagements coming up, including a charity concert where she would perform publicly, a rare occurrence that always made her anxious. "Shall I lay out the blue dress for this morning's meeting?" Sarah asked, referring to Charlotte's scheduled appointment with the organizers of a children's literacy foundation. "The blue is fine," Charlotte replied absently, her mind already in the music room, wondering if James would remember their arrangement, if he would actually appear, if yesterday's interaction had been as meaningful to him as it had been to her. The meeting with the foundation representatives proceeded smoothly, though Charlotte found herself checking the clock on the mantelpiece more frequently than usual. She discussed reading programs and funding initiatives with the practiced ease of someone who had been participating in such meetings since adolescence. But part of her mind remained focused on the approaching afternoon and the promise of musical communion she'd made. By the time Charlotte made her way to the music room that afternoon, she had convinced herself that James wouldn't come. It had been presumptuous of her to assume that a palace guard would be interested in listening to her play, protocol issues aside. He'd probably realized the inappropriateness of the situation and would maintain proper professional distance from now on. But as she settled at the piano and began her warm-up exercises, she heard familiar footsteps in the corridor outside. Her heart rate quickened as she recognized the measured pace of James's approach. A moment later, his gentle knock came at the doorframe. "Your Royal Highness? You mentioned you were working on something new." Charlotte looked up, unable to suppress the smile that spread across her face. "You came." "I said I would," James replied simply, stepping into the room with the same careful respect he'd shown the day before. "I've been looking forward to it all day, if I'm being honest." His admission surprised Charlotte with its directness. In her world, people rarely admitted to looking forward to anything involving her personally. Anticipation was reserved for the honor of royal presence, not for genuine personal connection. "I chose something I thought you might enjoy," she said, indicating the sheet music spread across the piano. "Debussy. It's quite different from the Rachmaninoff." "I'm entirely in your hands," James said, positioning himself where he could see her hands on the keys. I'm learning that there's much more to classical music than I ever realized. Charlotte began to play, and immediately she felt the same sense of liberation she'd experienced the day before. Having James there as her audience seemed to unlock something in her performance, allowing her to take interpretive risks she'd never dared attempt even in private practice. The opening measures of Clair de Lune flowed from her fingers like moonlight made audible. The piece's gentle rolling melody seemed to transform the music room into something otherworldly, a space where normal rules and conventions held no power. Charlotte allowed herself to be completely present in the music, aware of James's quiet attention but not self-conscious about it. As she progressed through the piece, she began to understand what Mrs. Hartwell had been trying to teach her about emotional expression in music. With James listening, really listening, not just waiting for the performance to end so he could offer polite praise, she felt safe to reveal the deeper feelings the music evoked in her. The longing she felt for a life beyond royal duty, the isolation that came with her position, the desire to be known and understood for who she truly was beneath the titles and expectations, all of it poured through her fingers onto the keys. The music became a conversation, a sharing of something essential about herself that she'd never been able to articulate in words. When the final ethereal notes faded into silence, Charlotte realized she was breathing differently, as if the music had somehow changed her internal rhythm. She looked up to find James watching her with an expression of deep thoughtfulness. "That was," he began, then paused, seeming to search for adequate words. "I felt like I was experiencing something private, something sacred. Thank you for sharing that with me." Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks, but it wasn't embarrassment this time. It was something warmer, more complex. "Music has always been my truest form of expression. It's where I can be completely honest. I've never heard anything quite like that. The way you play, it's as if the piano becomes an extension of yourself." They fell into comfortable conversation about the piece, with Charlotte explaining some of the technical challenges and James asking perceptive questions that revealed he was developing a genuine appreciation for the complexities of classical music. As they talked, Charlotte began to see James not just as the guard who happened to appreciate her playing, but as an individual, with his own thoughts, interests, and insights. She learned that he'd grown up in a small village in Oxfordshire, the son of a teacher and a local shopkeeper. He joined the military after university, served overseas, and eventually found his way to the palace security detail through a combination of qualifications and recommendations. His path to this moment couldn't have been more different from hers, yet somehow they'd found this unexpected common ground. "What made you want to work at the palace?" Charlotte asked, genuinely curious about his motivations. James considered the question carefully. "Honestly, the stability and the honor of the position were the practical reasons. But there was something else, a sense that this place represents something enduring in a world that changes very quickly. There's comfort in being part of something larger than yourself." And Charlotte was struck by the thoughtfulness of his response. "Do you ever feel invisible here? Like you're present but not seen?" The question seemed to surprise James, but he answered honestly. "Sometimes. We're trained to blend into the background, to be professional ghosts. But I've never minded it. There's a certain freedom in observing without being observed. Until now," Charlotte said softly. "Until now," he agreed, meeting her eyes directly. "This is the first time I've felt truly seen in this place." The honesty of the moment hung between them, charged with implications neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Charlotte felt as though she was standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, something that could change everything about how she understood her place in the world. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Charlotte's private secretary's voice in the corridor, calling her name. The outside world reasserted itself with jarring suddenness, reminding them both of the boundaries that governed their respective positions. "I should go," James said, immediately shifting back into his professional demeanor. "Thank you again for the music." "Same time tomorrow?" Charlotte asked, trying to keep her voice casual despite the urgency she felt. "I'll be here," James promised, and then he was gone, leaving Charlotte alone with her thoughts and the lingering resonance of the afternoon's revelations. Over the following weeks, their afternoon musical sessions became the highlights of Charlotte's days. She found herself selecting pieces not just for their technical challenges or emotional content, but for their potential to communicate something to James. Bach for intellectual complexity, Chopin for romantic yearning, Satie for whimsical playfulness. Each composer became a different facet of a conversation they were having through music. James, meanwhile, was developing a sophisticated understanding of classical music that surprised them both. He began to recognize different composers by their distinctive styles, to anticipate the emotional arcs of complex pieces, to ask questions that revealed genuine musical curiosity rather than polite interest. More importantly, their post-performance conversations were evolving into something deeper than discussions about music. They talked about books, about travel, about their different perspectives on duty and responsibility. Charlotte began to see her privileged position through James's eyes. The weight of expectation, yes, but also the extraordinary opportunities for positive impact that her platform provided. James, in turn, began to understand the isolation and constraints that came with royal birth. He saw how Charlotte's every public moment was scrutinized, how her personal desires were often secondary to institutional needs, how genuine human connection was both precious and difficult to maintain in her position. "Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd been born into your world instead," Charlotte confided one afternoon after playing a particularly melancholy Chopin nocturne. "And I sometimes wonder what I would have done with the opportunities you've been given," James replied. "But I think you might have been remarkable in any circumstances. Your music tells me that much." Charlotte treasured these exchanges, these moments when they could speak to each other as equals, as friends, as two people genuinely interested in understanding each other's perspectives. She began to realize that what was developing between them was unlike any relationship she'd ever experienced. It was based on mutual respect, shared interests, and genuine affection, rather than the complex calculations of advantage and protocol that govern most of her social interactions. But their growing connection didn't go entirely unnoticed. Mrs. Hartwell, arriving for a lesson one afternoon, observed something different in Charlotte's playing. "Your technique has improved dramatically," she noted after Charlotte finished working through a complex Liszt etude. "But more than that, there's something new in your interpretation. You're playing with a confidence and emotional openness I've never heard from you before." Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks but tried to keep her voice steady. "I've been practicing more consistently." "It's more than practice," Mrs. Hartwell said, studying her student's face. "You're playing like someone who has something to say and someone to say it to. It's transformative." The observation was perceptive enough to make Charlotte uncomfortable, but she couldn't deny its accuracy. James's presence in her musical life had changed how she approached every piece, how she thought about performance and interpretation, how she understood the communicative power of music. As winter settled over London, their afternoon sessions took on an even more intimate quality. The music room's large windows framed views of bare trees and gray skies, creating a cozy atmosphere that seemed to encourage deeper conversation and more vulnerable musical expression. It was during one of these December afternoons that Charlotte made a decision that would alter the trajectory of both their lives. She'd been working on Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, a piece that required not just technical mastery, but profound emotional commitment. As she played through the dramatic first movement, she realized she wanted to share not just this performance, but the entire experience of learning and growing as a musician with James. "Would you like to hear this piece performed professionally?" she asked after finishing the movement. "There's a concert at the Royal Albert Hall next week. The London Symphony Orchestra is performing it." James looked surprised. "That sounds wonderful, but I'm not sure how. I have a private box." Charlotte said quickly, "I often attend concerts there. You could accompany me as part of the security detail." The suggestion hung between them, both understanding that this would cross yet another line in their relationship. Sharing private musical moments in the palace was one thing. Appearing together in public, even with the cover of professional necessity, was something else entirely. James was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering the implications. "Are you certain that would be appropriate?" Charlotte met his eyes directly. "I'm certain that I want to share this experience with someone who would truly appreciate it. Whether it's appropriate, that's becoming less important to me than what feels right." Her honesty surprised them both. Charlotte had spent her entire life carefully weighing appropriateness against desire, duty against personal fulfillment. The idea of choosing what felt right over what was expected was both thrilling and terrifying. "Then yes," James said finally, "I would be honored to accompany you." As they made tentative plans for the concert, Charlotte felt as though she was stepping into uncharted territory. The careful boundaries that had defined their relationship were shifting, evolving into something that couldn't be easily categorized or controlled. That evening, as she prepared for dinner with visiting dignitaries, Charlotte caught herself humming the Rachmaninoff concerto. Her lady's maid noticed her unusually bright mood, but attributed it to excitement about the upcoming concert. If only she knew, Charlotte thought, that her anticipation had less to do with the music itself than with the prospect of experiencing it alongside someone who had become, against all odds and expectations, genuinely important to her. The concert was still a week away, but Charlotte already knew it would mark another milestone in a relationship that was redefining everything she thought she understood about connection, duty, and the possibilities that existed within the constraints of her extraordinary life. For the first time, she was allowing herself to imagine what it might feel like to follow her heart rather than her obligations. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. But as she fell asleep that night with Rachmaninoff's melodies still echoing in her mind, Charlotte knew there was no going back. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage and honesty she'd learned to bring to her music, completely, authentically, and without reservation. The Royal Albert Hall stood majestically against the London evening sky, its distinctive dome silhouetted against storm clouds that had been gathering throughout the afternoon. Charlotte felt a flutter of nervous excitement as their car approached the venue, but it had less to do with the prestigious concert they were about to attend than with the man sitting beside her in the back seat, maintaining the perfect posture and professional demeanor expected of palace security. James wore his formal security uniform, complete with the discreet earpiece that connected him to the broader protection detail. To any observer, he was simply one of Princess Charlotte's guards, accompanying her to a cultural event as part of his assigned duties. But Charlotte was acutely aware of the tension beneath his composed exterior, the way his eyes occasionally met hers in the car's reflection before quickly looking away. They had spent the past week in their usual afternoon musical sessions, but something fundamental had shifted between them since Charlotte's invitation to the concert. Their conversations had taken on an undercurrent of anticipation, an awareness that tonight would represent another step forward in a relationship that was already far beyond anything either had initially imagined. "The acoustics in the Albert Hall are supposed to be extraordinary," Charlotte said as they made their way through the venue's grand entrance, past the marble columns and ornate Victorian architecture. "I'm looking forward to experiencing it," James replied formally, his voice carrying just the slightest emphasis that reminded Charlotte of their shared secret, that this evening was about much more than official duty. Charlotte's private box was located in the grand tier, offering an excellent view of both the stage and the hall's magnificent interior. The curved ceiling soared overhead, decorated with elaborate plasterwork that caught and reflected the warm glow of the chandeliers. As they settled into their seats, Charlotte noticed how James took in every detail of their surroundings, his expression revealing genuine appreciation for the venue's historical significance and architectural beauty. "Have you been to many classical concerts?" Charlotte asked, keeping her voice low as other patrons filled the surrounding boxes. "This is actually my first," James admitted. "I've always been curious about it, but somehow never made the time. Thank you for making this possible." The honesty of his response touched Charlotte. She realized that in bringing him here, she wasn't just sharing an experience she loved, she was introducing him to something entirely new, giving him access to a world he might never have entered otherwise. The responsibility of that felt both significant and deeply personal. As the lights dimmed and the London Symphony Orchestra took the stage, Charlotte felt a familiar thrill of anticipation. But tonight it was magnified by James's presence beside her, by the knowledge that she would experience every note, every musical phrase, through both her own well-trained ears and his fresh perspective. The concert opened with Mozart's Symphony, numbers 40 apiece. Charlotte had heard countless times, but never in quite this context. She found herself acutely aware of James's reactions, the way he leaned slightly forward during the dramatic opening measures, how his breathing seemed to synchronize with the music's rhythm, the small smile that appeared during particularly beautiful passages. Watching James discover the power of live orchestral music was like experiencing it for the first time herself. She saw him realize how different it was from the recorded versions he might have heard, how the physical presence of dozens of musicians creating sound together generated an energy that no recording could capture. During the intermission, They remained in their box while other patrons mingled in the corridors below. The relative privacy allowed for more relaxed conversation, though both remained mindful of their public setting. "I had no idea," James said, his voice filled with wonder. "The way the music filled the entire space, the way you could feel it as well as hear it. And watching the musicians work together like that, it's like witnessing something miraculous." Charlotte smiled at his enthusiasm. "Wait until you hear the Rachmaninoff. If you think Mozart was impressive, the piano concerto will be overwhelming." "Is this how you felt the first time you attended a concert like this?" James asked. Charlotte considered the question. "I'm not sure I remember my first time clearly enough. I've been attending concerts since I was very young. But watching you experience it tonight, it's reminding me why I fell in love with music in the first place." The second half of the concert featured Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 4. 2, performed by a renowned Russian pianist whose technique was flawless, and whose interpretation was both powerful and deeply moving. Charlotte had heard this piece performed many times, but tonight she found herself experiencing it through dual consciousness. Her own trained musical understanding and James's emotional response to hearing it for the first time. As the piano's opening chords resonated through the hall, Charlotte noticed James's immediate physical reaction to the music's emotional intensity. His posture changed, becoming more alert, more receptive. When the orchestra joined the piano in the work's sweeping romantic themes, she saw him close his eyes, allowing himself to be completely absorbed by the sound. Charlotte realized she was witnessing something profound. James's genuine, unguarded response to great music. There was no pretense in his reaction, no attempt to appear cultured or knowledgeable. He was simply allowing himself to be moved by what he was hearing, and his authentic emotional engagement was more beautiful than any technically perfect but emotionally distant performance she'd ever witnessed. The concerto's famous second movement, with its achingly beautiful melody, seemed to affect James particularly deeply. Charlotte watched as he unconsciously pressed his hand to his chest, as if trying to contain the emotion the music was generating. She realized that this was exactly what she'd been trying to achieve in her own playing, this kind of direct emotional communication that bypassed intellectual analysis and spoke directly to the heart. When the final triumphant notes of the concerto faded and the audience erupted in applause, James turned to Charlotte with an expression of amazement. "I understand now," he said, his voice barely audible above the continuing ovation, "why you spend so much time with music. It's not just entertainment, is it? It's something essential." Charlotte felt tears prick at her eyes, not from the music, beautiful as it had been, but from the realization that James truly understood what music meant to her. He hadn't just enjoyed the concert, he'd grasped something fundamental about her deepest passions and priorities. As they made their way out of the hall among the crowd of departing concert-goers, Charlotte felt as though something significant had changed between them. Sharing this musical experience had created a new level of intimacy, a deeper mutual understanding that went beyond their previous conversations in the Palace music room. The car ride back to Kensington Palace was quieter than their journey to the concert, but it was a comfortable, contemplative silence. Both seemed to be processing what they'd experienced, not just the music, but the significance of having shared it together. "Thank you," James said as they approached the palace gates. "Tonight was transformative. I don't think I'll ever hear music the same way again." Charlotte turned to face him in the car's dim interior. "Thank you for being there with me. I've attended dozens of concerts, but I've never enjoyed one quite as much as tonight." Their eyes met, and held for a moment longer than was strictly appropriate, both acknowledging that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. They were no longer just a princess and her guard who happened to share musical moments. They were two people who had discovered a deep connection through shared aesthetic and emotional experiences. Over the following days, their afternoon music sessions took on a new depth and intensity. Charlotte found herself choosing pieces that would showcase the musical insights James had gained from their concert experience, while he asked more sophisticated questions about interpretation and technique. But more significantly, their conversations began to venture into more personal territory. James shared stories from his military service, his observations about human nature gained from years of protective duty, his thoughts about purpose and meaning in life. Charlotte, in turn, opened up about the challenges of her position, her struggles with public expectations, her dreams for the kind of impact she wanted to have in the world. One afternoon in late December, as snow began to fall outside the music room's tall windows, Charlotte was working through a complex Bach fugue when she became aware that James was watching her hands with unusual intensity. "What is it?" she asked, pausing in her practice. "I was thinking about what you said the first day we really talked. About music being your truest form of expression," James said. "Watching you play, especially after hearing professional musicians at the concert, I realize there's something different about your approach." Charlotte tilted her head, curious. "Different how?" "Professional musicians are incredibly skilled, obviously. But when you play, there's something more personal, more vulnerable. It's as if you're not just performing the music, you're living it." The observation was so perceptive that Charlotte felt momentarily exposed. "I suppose when you spend as much time alone with music as I have, it becomes less about performance and more about communication." "Communication with whom?" James asked gently. Charlotte met his eyes directly. "Until recently, I would have said communication with myself. Or maybe with the composers whose work I'm playing. But lately," she paused, unsure how to finish the thought. "Lately?" James prompted. "Lately I've been playing for you," Charlotte admitted, her cheeks flushing at the confession. "Even when you're not here, I find myself imagining how you might respond to a particular passage, what emotions it might evoke for you." The honesty of her admission hung between them, more intimate than any physical gesture. James was quiet for a long moment, clearly moved by her words. "I think about our sessions when I'm making my rounds," he said finally. "The music you play, the way you play it, it's become the best part of my day. More than that, it's changed how I understand what it means to be truly present with another person." Charlotte felt her heart race at his words. They were approaching territory that neither could navigate safely, acknowledging feelings that could have serious consequences for both their positions and their futures. "James," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what she was feeling. "I know," he said quietly. "I know this is complicated. I know there are rules and expectations and consequences neither of us can ignore. But I also know that what's happening between us is real and important, and unlike anything I've ever experienced." Charlotte rose from the piano bench and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered gardens. James remained where he was, respecting her need for physical space while they navigated this emotional minefield. "When I was younger," Charlotte said without turning around, "I used to imagine what it would be like to meet someone who could see past all the titles and protocols and expectations. Someone who would know me, really know me, for who I am underneath all the royal trappings." "And what did you imagine that would feel like?" James asked. Charlotte turned to face him. "Terrifying and wonderful and completely impossible. Rather like this, actually." They looked at each other across the elegant music room, both acutely aware that they were standing at a crossroads. Whatever happened next would determine not just the future of their relationship, but how they each understood their place in the carefully ordered world of the palace. "What are we doing, James?" Charlotte asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think," James said carefully, "we're being honest about something that matters more than either of us expected it to. What we do about that honesty, that's the question we'll have to answer." Charlotte nodded, recognizing the truth in his words. They had moved far beyond the safe boundaries of princess and guard, beyond even the more comfortable territory of friends who shared a love of music. They were now two people confronting the reality of deep, mutual attraction and emotional connection in circumstances that made any traditional relationship impossible. But as Charlotte returned to the piano and began playing a gentle Schubert impromptu, she realized that impossible didn't necessarily mean wrong. Some of the most beautiful things in the world existed in defiance of practical limitations. Perhaps what was growing between her and James belonged in that category, something precious, precisely because it was unlikely, something worth protecting regardless of the challenges it might bring. The snow continued to fall outside as the afternoon light began to fade, creating a cocoon of intimacy around their shared musical space. Whatever decisions lay ahead, whatever complications awaited them, Charlotte knew that these moments, filled with music and understanding and the kind of authentic human connection she'd always longed for, were worth whatever price she might have to pay for them. As the last notes of the Schubert faded into the gathering twilight, Charlotte realized that her life had been irreversibly changed by the presence of the man who sat listening in the shadows, who had somehow seen straight through to her heart and chosen to stay there. January brought an unusual tension to Kensington Palace that seemed to permeate even the most routine daily activities. The holiday season had passed with its typical round of official celebrations and public appearances, but underneath the familiar pageantry, Charlotte sensed that change was brewing. The palace staff moved with a heightened awareness. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms, and her private secretary had begun scheduling meetings with unusual frequency and urgency. Charlotte's relationship with James had continued to deepen throughout the winter months, their daily musical sessions becoming more intimate and emotionally charged with each passing afternoon. They had learned to communicate through subtle glances and carefully chosen words, developing a private language that allowed them to express feelings that could never be spoken aloud in their official capacities. But the very intensity of their connection was beginning to create problems that neither had fully anticipated. Charlotte found it increasingly difficult to maintain her composure during official events when James was present in his professional capacity. The sight of him in uniform, standing at attention while she performed her royal duties, created a cognitive dissonance that was both painful and distracting. James, meanwhile, was struggling with the ethical implications of his feelings for the woman he was sworn to protect. His military training had emphasized the absolute importance of maintaining professional boundaries, but his growing emotional attachment to Charlotte made every interaction feel like a betrayal of his duty, either to his position or to his heart. The situation came to a head on a gray Tuesday morning in mid-January when Charlotte's private secretary, Margaret Thornfield, requested an urgent private meeting. Margaret had served the royal family for over 20 years and possessed an instinct for potential problems that bordered on supernatural. Charlotte knew immediately that this conversation would not be pleasant.
"Your Royal Highness," Margaret began formally, her expression grave, "I need to discuss a matter of some delicacy with you." Charlotte maintained her composure, though her heart began to race. "Of course, Margaret, what seems to be the concern?" Margaret consulted the leather portfolio in her lap, though Charlotte suspected she knew its contents by heart. "It's been brought to my attention that you've been spending considerable time with Guard Rothwell. More time than would typically be expected in a professional capacity." The words hit Charlotte like physical blows. Someone had been watching, documenting, analyzing her private moments with James. The violation felt profound and deeply personal. "Guard Rothwell has been present during some of my piano practice sessions," Charlotte said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. "I wasn't aware that required special approval." Margaret's expression softened slightly, but her concern remained evident. "Ma'am, I've served this family long enough to recognize when something develops beyond professional boundaries. I'm not here to judge or criticize, but I am here to protect you from potential complications that could affect both your personal well-being and your public position." Charlotte felt a surge of defensive anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What exactly are you suggesting, Margaret?" "I'm suggesting that whatever has developed between you and Guard Rothwell, it's becoming noticeable to others. Palace staff talk, and those conversations eventually reach ears beyond these walls. We need to address this situation before it becomes a problem that could damage your reputation or compromise the security protocols that keep you safe." The implications of Margaret's words settled over Charlotte like a heavy blanket. She had known, intellectually, that her relationship with James existed in defiance of countless protocols and expectations, but hearing it articulated so directly forced her to confront the reality of their situation in a way she had been avoiding. "What are you recommending?" Charlotte asked quietly. Margaret hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what she had to say next. "The most prudent course would be to reassign Guard Rothwell to a different detail, preferably outside the palace. It would be handled discreetly, presented as a promotion or a transfer based on his exemplary service record." Charlotte felt as though the floor had shifted beneath her feet. The idea of James being removed from the palace, of losing their daily interactions, of having no legitimate reason to see him, was almost unbearable. "That seems extreme," she managed to say. "Surely there must be other ways to address whatever concerns have been raised." "Ma'am," Margaret said gently, "in my experience, situations like this rarely resolve themselves through half measures.
The feelings involved tend to intensify rather than diminish over time. A clean break, while painful, is usually the kindest option for everyone involved. Charlotte rose abruptly from her chair and moved to the window, needing physical movement to process the emotional turbulence Margaret's words had triggered. Outside, the palace gardens lay dormant under a thin layer of frost, waiting for spring's eventual return. "How long do I have?" Charlotte asked without turning around. "The transfer orders could be processed within the week," Margaret replied. "But ma'am, if I may say so, this decision might actually be a blessing in disguise. Guard Rothwell is a fine man, but you're in a position where you could have any number of appropriate partners. This attachment, while understandable, isn't in your best interests long term." Charlotte finally turned back to face her secretary. "And what if I disagree with that assessment? Then we would need to have a very different conversation, one involving much more senior members of the household staff and possibly your parents. Is that what you want?" The threat was clear, though delivered with the gentle courtesy that characterized all of Margaret's interactions. Charlotte realized she was being offered a choice between voluntary compliance and escalated intervention. Neither option would allow her to maintain her relationship with James. "I need time to think," Charlotte said. "Of course, but please don't take too long. These situations have a way of developing their own momentum if left unaddressed." After Margaret left, Charlotte remained in her sitting room for a long time, staring out at the winter landscape and trying to process the impossible position she found herself in. She had always known that her freedom to choose her own relationships was limited, but she had never been forced to confront those limitations so directly. When the time came for her usual afternoon music session, Charlotte made her way to the music room with a heavy heart. She knew she would have to tell James about Margaret's ultimatum, but she had no idea how to begin that conversation or what they might do in response. James was waiting for her as usual, but his expression was troubled. Charlotte realized immediately that he had already heard something about their situation. "We need to talk," they said simultaneously, then shared a rueful smile despite the gravity of their circumstances. "You first," Charlotte said, settling at the piano bench, though she made no move to begin playing. "My supervisor called me in this morning," James said, his voice carefully controlled. "There have been observations about my assignment to your detail, questions about whether I'm maintaining appropriate professional boundaries." Charlotte closed her eyes, feeling the walls of their carefully constructed private world beginning to crumble. "Margaret spoke to me this morning as well. They want to transfer you." "I know," James said quietly. "The orders are being prepared." They looked at each other across the music room, both understanding that they were facing the end of something precious and irreplaceable. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows seemed different somehow, charged with the poignancy of impending loss. "What do we do?" Charlotte asked, surprised by how small her voice sounded. James was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with his response. "I've been asking myself that same question all day, and the truth is, I don't know. Everything I've been trained for, everything about my position and my duty, says that we should accept this transfer and put this behind us." "But," Charlotte prompted, hearing something in his voice that suggested he wasn't finished, "but I also know that what we've found together is real and rare and worth fighting for, even if I'm not sure what that fight would look like." Charlotte rose from the piano bench and moved closer to him, close enough that she could see the conflict in his eyes, the way he was torn between duty and desire. "If you were transferred, would that be the end of it?" she asked. "Would we just never see each other again?" "That would be the expectation," James said. "A clean break, as they put it." Charlotte felt anger building alongside her grief. "Doesn't it seem fundamentally unfair that other people get to decide who we care about, who we spend time with, who we connect with? Fairness isn't really a consideration in situations like ours," James replied sadly. "Your position comes with privileges, but also with constraints that most people never have to navigate. And my position means I serve at the pleasure of the crown, which ultimately means serving your family's interests as they define them." "What if we refused?" Charlotte asked suddenly. "What if we simply said no to the transfer, no to ending this relationship, no to allowing other people to dictate our personal choices?" James looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. The consequences would be severe for both of us, but especially for you. Your family, the institution, your future role, all of that could be compromised. Charlotte moved to the window, looking out at the gardens where she had played as a child, where she had learned to present the perfect royal facade to the world. Sometimes I wonder if the cost of maintaining this institution is too high, if the sacrifice of personal happiness and authentic relationships is really worth it. Charlotte, James said, using her given name for the first time in their formal conversation, you can't make that kind of decision based on one relationship, no matter how meaningful it is. You have responsibilities that affect millions of people. She turned back to him, tears threatening for the first time since their conversation began. But what about my responsibility to myself? What about my right to choose love over duty, connection over protocol? James approached her slowly, stopping just close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence without actually touching her. If you're asking me what I want, the answer is simple. I want to find a way to be with you that doesn't destroy everything else that matters to you. But if you're asking me what I think we should do, I honestly don't know. They stood there in the fading afternoon light, two people who had discovered something beautiful and now faced losing it to forces entirely beyond their control. Charlotte realized that this was what growing up really meant, not just accepting responsibility, but learning to navigate the impossible choices that responsibility sometimes demanded. How long do we have? She asked. The transfer is scheduled for the end of the week unless something changes. Charlotte nodded, making a decision that surprised even her. Then we need to make the most of the time we have left, and we need to decide whether we're going to let this end here or whether we're going to find another way. What are you thinking? James asked, recognizing something determined in her expression. I'm thinking that I've spent my entire life accepting limitations I never chose, following rules I never agreed to, prioritizing other people's expectations over my own desires, and maybe it's time to consider whether there might be another way to live. James studied her face, seeing something in her expression that was both hopeful and slightly dangerous. Are you talking about changing how you approach your royal duties, or are you talking about something more fundamental? I'm talking about whatever it takes to create a life where we don't have to choose between duty and happiness, where we can find a way to honor both. The conversation that followed lasted well into the evening, ranging across possibilities they had never dared to discuss, options that would require courage neither was certain they possessed. By the time they finally parted, both understood that the next few days would determine not just the future of their relationship, but the entire trajectory of Charlotte's life. As Charlotte made her way back to her apartments that night, she carried with her the weight of impending choice and the strange exhilaration that comes with finally deciding to stop accepting the unacceptable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new possibilities for both disaster and triumph. But tonight she allowed herself to hope that love might prove stronger than protocol, that authentic connection might triumph over institutional expectation, and that two people who had found something real and precious together might somehow find a way to protect it against all odds. The morning of Thursday, January 23rd, dawned gray and cold over London, with a fine mist that seemed to blur the edges of everything it touched. Charlotte woke before her alarm, her mind immediately focused on the decision she had made during the sleepless hours of the previous night. Today, she would take control of her own narrative, regardless of the consequences. She had spent the past 3 days in intensive conversations with James, exploring every possible alternative to the separation that seemed inevitable. They had considered secret meetings, coded communications, even the possibility of James leaving his position voluntarily to pursue civilian work that might bring them into the same social circles. But every scenario they imagined was fraught with deception and risk, built on foundations that seemed unlikely to sustain the weight of genuine relationship. Charlotte's morning routine proceeded as usual, but internally she felt the strange calm that comes with having made an irrevocable decision. Her lady's maid, Sarah, noticed nothing unusual about her demeanor, but Charlotte was acutely aware that this might be one of the last mornings she would wake up as simply Princess Charlotte, dutiful daughter, compliant royal. The precipitating event came sooner than expected. At 10 o'clock, Charlotte received word that her parents had returned unexpectedly from Scotland and requested her immediate presence in her father's private study. Margaret Thornfield's expression when she delivered this message told Charlotte everything she needed to know. Their situation had been escalated beyond the household staff level. Charlotte made her way through the familiar corridors of Kensington Palace, past portraits of ancestors who had navigated their own impossible choices between personal desire and royal duty. She found herself wondering how many of them had chosen duty, how many had found ways to choose both, and how many had simply accepted that happiness was a luxury their positions couldn't afford. Prince William was waiting in his study, standing near the window with his back to the door when Charlotte entered. The formal setting and his rigid posture told her immediately that this was not going to be a casual father-daughter conversation. "Charlotte," he said, turning to face her. "Please sit down." She remained standing, instinctively recognizing that this conversation would require her to maintain every advantage she could. "I prefer to stand, thank you." William's expression grew troubled. "I've received some concerning reports about your conduct over the past several months. Reports that suggest you may have developed an inappropriate attachment to a member of your security detail." Charlotte had rehearsed this moment in her mind dozens of times, but now that it was actually happening, she found herself surprised by her own composure. "Define inappropriate." "Charlotte, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. You know as well as I do that romantic relationships between royal family members and staff are absolutely prohibited. The security implications alone are staggering, never mind the protocol violations and potential public relations disasters." "I understand the concerns," Charlotte said carefully. "But I think you may be operating on incomplete information about the nature of my friendship with Guard Rothwell."
William's expression hardened. "Friendship?"
"Charlotte, I've seen the reports. You've been spending hours alone with this man, attending public events together, engaging in conversations and activities that go far beyond any reasonable professional interaction." Charlotte felt her carefully planned composure beginning to crack. "So I'm being surveilled by my own security detail? My private conversations are being monitored and reported? Your safety and the security of this family require constant vigilance. That includes being aware of potential security compromises. And a guard who develops personal feelings for his principal represents exactly that kind of compromise." The clinical way her father discussed James as though he were simply a security problem to be solved rather than a person with his own thoughts and feelings ignited Charlotte's anger in a way she hadn't anticipated. "His name is James," she said sharply, "and he has served this family with distinction for 2 years. If you're going to destroy his career and banish him from the palace, at least have the courtesy to acknowledge him as a human being rather than just a security compromise." William's eyebrows rose at his daughter's tone. "Charlotte, I understand you may have developed feelings for this young man, but you need to understand that such relationships are simply not possible in your position. The sooner you accept that reality, the easier this transition will be for everyone involved." "What if I don't accept it?" Charlotte asked quietly. "I beg your pardon? What if I refuse to accept that my position requires me to sacrifice every possibility of genuine human connection? What if I decide that some things are more important than institutional convenience?" William stared at his daughter as though seeing her clearly for the first time. "Charlotte, you're talking about abandoning your responsibilities, your duty to your country and your family. You can't be serious." "I'm talking about finding a balance between duty and personal fulfillment that doesn't require me to sacrifice everything that makes life worth living." William moved to his desk and sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking older than his years. "Do you have any idea what you're suggesting? The constitutional implications, the impact on the monarchy's stability, the precedent you would set for future generations?" Charlotte remained standing, drawing strength from her physical position above her seated father. "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time for the monarchy to evolve, to acknowledge that royal family members are human beings with the same needs for love and connection as everyone else." "And James Rothwell? What role does he play in this grand reformation you're proposing?" For the first time since the conversation began, Charlotte smiled. "James is the person who reminded me that authentic connection is possible, even in my position. He's the person who sees me as Charlotte first and Princess second. He's the person I want to build a life with, whatever form that life might take." William was quiet for a long moment, studying his daughter's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. "Charlotte, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about your personal happiness. Every choice you make reflects on this institution, affects public perception of the monarchy, influences how people view the relevance and legitimacy of everything we represent."
"I do understand that," Charlotte replied.
"But I also understand that an institution built on the systematic sacrifice of its members' personal happiness might not be worth preserving in its current form.
The words hung between them like a challenge, acknowledging the fundamental tension that had been building throughout Charlotte's life but had never been articulated so directly. "What exactly are you proposing?" William asked finally.
Charlotte took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. "I'm proposing that James remain in his current position, that our relationship be acknowledged and accepted, and that we find a way to integrate personal fulfillment with royal duty, rather than treating them as mutually exclusive."
"And if that's not possible?" Charlotte met her father's eyes directly. "Then I'll need to consider whether my royal duties are compatible with the kind of life I want to live." The threat was clear, though Charlotte delivered it without malice or dramatic emphasis.
She was simply stating a fact, that her continued participation in royal life was contingent on finding some accommodation for her personal happiness. William's expression grew grave.
"Charlotte, you're threatening to abandon your position, your family, everything you were born to, for a relationship that began less than 6 months ago with a man you barely know."
"I'm not threatening anything," Charlotte corrected. "I'm stating my priorities and asking for your help in finding a way to honor both my responsibilities and my personal needs. But if forced to choose between duty without happiness and happiness without duty, I choose happiness." The conversation that followed lasted for more than 2 hours, ranging across constitutional law, family history, public relations strategy, and the complex emotional landscape of royal obligation. Charlotte found herself drawing on reserves of strength and articulation she hadn't known she possessed, while her father struggled to balance his roles as king, institution, and concerned parent. During a particularly tense exchange about precedent and public perception, Charlotte made a statement that shifted the entire dynamic of their discussion. "Dad," she said, using the informal address deliberately, "you and Mum found a way to build a genuine partnership that strengthened rather than weakened your ability to serve. George will someday need to find someone who can share the burdens of his future role. Louis will need to carve out his own meaningful place within the institution. All of us need to find ways to be authentic human beings while fulfilling our royal obligations. I'm just the first to insist on it explicitly." William was quiet for a long time, processing the implications of his daughter's words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of resignation mixed with something that might have been pride. "What you're asking for isn't impossible, but it would require significant changes in how we approach royal relationships and public presentation. It would require James to undergo extensive background investigations, protocol training, media preparation. It would require you to accept that your relationship would be subject to public scrutiny and institutional oversight in ways that most couples never experience." Charlotte felt her heart racing with hope and terror in equal measure. "Are you saying it might be possible?" "I'm saying that if you're absolutely certain about your feelings, and if James is equally committed to navigating the complexities of this situation, then perhaps we can find a way to make it work. But Charlotte, there would be conditions, expectations, compromises that might change the nature of your relationship in ways you haven't considered." "Such as?" William consulted his notes, though Charlotte suspected he had been thinking about these contingencies since the conversation began. "James would need to transition from security to a different role within the household, something that would provide legitimate grounds for your continued interaction without the ethical conflicts inherent in his current position. Your relationship would need to develop transparently, with appropriate supervision and guidance. Eventually, if things progressed, there would need to be public announcement, engagement periods, all the traditional steps that allow the public and the institution to adjust to the change." Charlotte nodded, recognizing both the opportunity and the challenges her father was describing. "And James, what would need to happen with his transfer orders? If he's agreeable to these conditions, the transfer could be postponed while we explore alternative arrangements. But Charlotte, this path isn't easier than the separation Margaret recommended. It's more complicated, more demanding, and far riskier for everyone involved." For the first time in days, Charlotte felt genuine hope. "But it's possible?" "It's possible," William confirmed. "The question is whether it's wise." Charlotte moved to the window, looking out at the gardens where she had played as a child, where she had learned to balance duty with desire, public presentation with private authenticity. "I think the wisdom depends on whether we believe that human happiness and institutional service can coexist, or whether we accept that one must always be sacrificed for the other." "And you believe they can coexist?" Charlotte turned back to face her father. seeing in his expression not just a king weighing constitutional implications, but a parent trying to understand his daughter's needs and find a way to support them. I believe they have to coexist. Because the alternative, a monarchy populated by people who have given up the possibility of authentic human connection, isn't sustainable in the long term. People can sense when their leaders are genuinely fulfilled versus when they're simply performing their obligations. And right now, the world needs leaders who can demonstrate that duty and happiness, service and love, institutional loyalty and personal authenticity can strengthen rather than diminish each other. The conversation concluded with tentative agreement to explore the possibilities Charlotte had outlined, contingent on James's willingness to accept the challenges and constraints such a path would entail. As Charlotte made her way back to her apartments, she felt as though she had crossed a bridge from which there was no return. That evening, as she waited in the music room for what might be James's last official duty assignment to her detail, Charlotte reflected on the conversation with her father and the choice she had made to fight for love rather than simply accept its loss. When James appeared in the doorway, his expression questioning and hopeful, Charlotte rose from the piano bench and moved toward him with a smile that conveyed everything words couldn't express. "We need to talk," she said, echoing the words that had begun their journey toward honesty months earlier. "Good news or complicated news?" James asked. Charlotte laughed, feeling lighter than she had in days. "Complicated news that might turn out to be very good news, if you're brave enough to help me figure out how to make it work." As they settled into the familiar rhythm of conversation that had sustained them through months of uncertainty, Charlotte realized that sometimes the most important battles were won not through dramatic gestures or royal proclamations, but through quiet insistence on the possibility of living authentically within even the most constraining circumstances. The music room around them seemed to pulse with the promise of continued shared afternoons, of melodies yet to be discovered together, of a love that had proven itself strong enough to reshape the very institution that had tried to contain it. And for the first time since their relationship began, Charlotte allowed herself to believe that she might not have to choose between duty and happiness after all. Outside, the London evening was settling into darkness, but inside the palace walls, two people who had found something precious together were beginning to envision a future where love and service might not just coexist, but strengthen and enrich each other in ways that could transform everything they touched.